So as part of the talk, this first talk, we have Robb Willer to speak to us. Robb is 3 times a professor at Stanford, professor of sociology, psychology, and organizational behavior. I don't know how like sociology and business kind of maybe fight it out a little bit.
But in my mind, yes. Yeah.
That's right, reconcile them. Robb is a leader in the field of understanding polarization and social change. And his work has really seemed to have done the impossible. So many of us study how to kind of increase respect across divides, but Robb has actually managed to persuade people across divides, which is something that not many of us can say that we have done. And so it's going to be great to hear about his research today. I think about 40, 50 minutes, and then I'll leave it open for question and answer. And Robb says he wants aggressive intellectual questions. At least he told me personally, and I'm going to tell everybody that. So the more we can challenge Robb, I think the more excited and happy he'll be to be here. So without further ado, thanks for coming, Robb, and you can take it away.
Thanks, Kurt. I appreciate it. Yes, please. Very aggressive, unfair questions. Ad hominem attacks, all of it, please. Let's see if I can get this slideshow going. Oh yeah, okay. So it's a pleasure to be meeting with you all today. Big fan of the center, big fan of Kurt's lab, which is one of the best moral and political psychology labs in the world. And I see a lot of familiar names here in this session. So yeah, so it's a lot of fun. Hello to everybody I know, and hi to people I don't. So my talk today is going to be about a technique of political persuasion that we call moral reframing, which we've been working on for about a decade. And what I want to try to do is lay out the basic logic of moral reframing and sort of tote up the evidence for it and identify limitations, boundary conditions, and so on, and then take your questions. Because we're going to be talking about political persuasion, I just want to lay the groundwork here of like, why would we study political persuasion? Why does it matter? Well, political persuasion is a major area of academic research, a multi-million-dollar industry, and a critical mechanism of social change. So hundreds of political strategists, analysts in the public and private sector, hundreds of academics, hundreds of activists, organizers spend months, years of their lives, millions of dollars trying to figure out how to change people's minds on political issues, trying to win elections, primaries, ballot initiatives, with a lot of the fate of governments and the trajectory of cultures and societies hanging to a great extent in the balance. So, if you've got some sort of social change initiative you'd like to see happen in the world, you're in the business of political persuasion, whether you want to be or not. And despite that, despite the fact that political persuasion is this major area of political activity, I mean, really like an industry unto itself in America and beyond, nonetheless, persuasion is really, really hard. And there's very good reason to think that the yield on the vast majority of this activity is really, really low, or possibly, null. So, for example, there's this famous meta-analysis by David Brockman and Josh Kalla that showed that the majority of campaign-embedded persuasion appeals, in the form of, especially ads, fail to move the needle and have no detectable effects, even in very well-powered designs, that should capture them. They don't increase support for candidates. They don't change the votes that the candidates get in the subsequent elections. And there's good reason to think that persuasion would be especially hard in the US context in particular. Why is that? Well, for one, the United States features really, notable levels of cultural and demographic diversity, both thinking historically and cross-culturally. So relative to other countries, you could make an argument that the US is the most, or one of the most culturally and demographically diverse countries in the world, and as culturally and demographically diverse as it has ever been, which makes persuasion very difficult because you're trying to cross identity lines, group lines that are often very hard to cross. Worse yet, the United States has really unusually high levels of polarization with strong partisan and ideological camps that don't want to agree with one another and have already staked out positions on most issues that you might want to persuade on. And the US here again really sticks out internationally and in its own history in terms of its levels of polarization. So there's these big group boundaries you have to cross. And then something that's, I think, very salient this week with, Joe Manchin's announcement that he won't be voting for for much of anything, is the United States has a pretty sclerotic system of state and federal government that makes it very, very hard to pass any significant legislation. You look at the last 13 years of US federal government, there's like one major piece of legislation that was passed, arguably, maybe two, depending on how you want to define that. So as a result, if you want to try to pass something on the basis of widespread popular support, which makes sense in a democracy, in the US system, you've got to hit like 60+% to really make a change initiative go through. So high bar, structurally very difficult to do. And so it's perhaps no surprise that we find that most persuasive appeals fail. So what could be an effective approach to persuasion? What could we do? How could we harness the academic literature to try to do this at least a little bit better? Well, one thing that we were thinking about a decade ago when we started puzzling over techniques of political persuasion in my lab is that maybe the tight link that's been identified between political views and moral views in the US and beyond offers some raw material for forging higher levels of political consensus across political divides. So the idea being that if you know that somebody has deeply held moral beliefs that are linked to their political views, then that gives you something you could try to connect to in making a political, a persuasive appeal to them on some political issue. And the technique that we've done the most research on is moral reframing. So this we define as reframing a political position to be consistent with an audience's moral values. And the basic logic of this technique is kind of cognitive dissonance based. It's basically, if you have deeply held moral commitments, if your moral commitments are your, as Kurt would say, most deeply held beliefs, this is the coinage, then assuming that you have political beliefs that are not as deeply held, then we could go to you and say the actual association between your most deeply held beliefs and political position X is this. Like, if you are going to care as much as you do about patriotism, then actually you ought to support same-sex marriage rather than oppose it as you do now. And if you can make a credible enough argument that they think makes sense, they're confronted with dissonance, where they're like, oh, okay, so patriotic people support same-sex marriage, but I don't. I need to move one of these things, or I should change the strength of one of these beliefs in order to restore cognitive consistency. I got to get in line here, because apparently if you're patriotic, you support same-sex marriage. Which one is easier to move? It's easier for me to move my view of same-sex marriage, which I don't feel as deeply about as I do about my levels of patriotism, which is one of my most deeply held beliefs. So this is kind of the basic logic, is you present people with an argument that they ought to hold political position X, given that their most deeply held moral belief is Y. So in order to implement this and start to test this idea, we're going to need some kind of a typology of moral values or most deeply held beliefs. And there's a variety of things out there that lend themselves to this. There's Schwader's work on cultural ethics. There's Schwartz values typology. We've used the moral foundations theory, which outlines 5 major domains of moral reasoning or moral thought, I guess, or moral judgment. But it's not the only way you could approach this. It's just the one we've used, and it's been helpful in our research. So I'll lay out what this is really quickly. So moral foundations theory is associated with Jonathan Haidt and Jesse Graham, and it argues that there are these 5 moral foundations that people think through, that people hold to different degrees, and cultures emphasize to different degrees. And I'll try to go through each one here, not assume people would know this theory, because why would you? So here are these 5 moral foundations. So one is equality and fairness. So people who would be very high in this moral foundation would be very concerned with whether a policy or an action they observe or a candidate promotes equality and the fair distribution of rewards and punishments in society. Care and harm, this captures especially empathy and compassion-based concerns about vulnerable groups, harm being done to vulnerable groups, and care and protection being extended to people who need it. And somebody who was high in this would be thinking, to what extent does this policy or this candidate or this action I've observed reflect showing that care and protecting people from harm? In-group loyalty, this moral foundation is, to what extent are groups that I care about being protected from attack, betrayal, To what extent are people showing loyalty to groups I care about? It's associated with patriotism, for example. Respect for authority. So somebody who cares a lot about this would be concerned with appropriate levels of deference and respect being shown to authority figures in hierarchies that they consider legitimate. And then finally, purity and sanctity. To what extent are sacred, pure things being protected from some kind of desecration or impurity? And this is the moral foundation that's most associated with religiosity. So these theorists clump these together into two different categories: the individualizing moral foundations, which are these first two, and then the binding moral foundations, which are these three, with the argument being that these binding moral foundations follow more of a group-based logic, a protection of groups, whereas the calculation of morality with these individualizing foundations is more at the individual level of whether individuals are getting their fair rewards, whether they're being protected from harm. We could have a debate about whether that is an appropriate categorization, but it is helpful in part for the following reason, which is that research shows pretty consistently that these two moral foundations tend to be endorsed more by liberals than by conservatives, and conservatives tend to endorse these moral foundations more than liberals do. And this should probably, strike you as relatively intuitive. Like, you hear more talk about equality and inequality and social justice amongst liberals, for example. You hear more talk about patriotism and purity and sanctity and sacredness amongst conservatives and amongst liberals. So this is helpful because this offers us some way to know, if I'm targeting a group for political persuasion, what do they care most deeply about? What are their most deeply held moral values? So, okay, so here are the two questions I'm going to try to answer in this talk. So one, does this persuasive technique of moral reframing work? And then also, do we do it? Because if we already do it, then it's not really that interesting or important to show that it works, because, well, it is still important to show that it works, but so it's just a second question, I think, of interest, whether or not we are doing this on autopilot already. Because if we are, you don't really need to watch this talk. You're already doing it, right? Okay, so the first study that we did to study this dynamic was actually, we conducted this study like 10 years ago in another time, in another place, in a time when people ran experiments often via Craigslist postings to try to recruit participants to studies. It's just a mythical land, I'll just ask you to imagine. And this was how we ran this study. We ran the study with about 300 participants that we recruited through Craigslist postings. We would play sort of whack-a-mole with Craigslist, which didn't like that we were doing these postings. And so we would have to put them up over and over and over again until we stopped doing it that way, because we became concerned they were upset with us. And we recruited 300 liberals and conservatives to a study where we would show them one of three essays before measuring their attitudes towards environmental protection. And the three essays were the following. So one of them was a pretty traditional message about the importance of environmental protection that was based on this moral value, this moral foundation of harm and care. And that message said things like, the dumping of waste and chemicals into our lakes and seas has resulted in the deaths of billions of fish and other sea life. The result is barren soil across the world, making it harder to produce food, resulting in famine and starvation. And it had these images of ecosystems that had been harmed and not protected, and it pretty much looked like what you would expect to hear from like the Sierra Club or something like that. We compared that to a very different environmental message that we hadn't thought that we had seen before, that was based on the value of purity and sanctity. And so this message said things like, it is important that we protect our natural habitats from desecration and pollution. Keeping our forests, drinking water, and skies pure is of vital importance. Chemical particles end up everywhere, in our food, on our skin, and inside our lungs. Dirty, polluted air actually enters our bodies and becomes a part of us. And it had these pictures of these like kind of gross, impure, city skyline, this dump, and then this very insane person drinking a dirty glass of water, which I would not advise you to. And then we compared it to a third essay, which is just designed to be neutral. It's an essay about the history of neckties. So let's see here. So here's what we found. So this is broken out by liberals and conservatives. Conservatives are the kind of reddish bar here. Liberals are the blue bars. And this is levels of support for environmental protection according to what essay people read. So some people read this control essay about neckties. Some people read the harm essay that we just talked about. And some people read the purity essay we just talked about. And this is the level of environmental protection support they showed afterwards. And so here we see that conservatives, this indicates whether a difference between these average values is statistically significant or not. And you can see that conservatives reported significantly more concern for environmental protection or support for environmental protection if they had just read this purity essay than if they had read either the harm or control essays, which was our prediction, was that this would increase conservatives' concern for environmental protection. And kind of the key differences here are all statistically significant. And also of note, the purity essay actually reduced the difference between liberals and conservatives' support for environmental protection to statistical insignificance. So that's noteworthy. And I think probably not representative of future studies. We don't tend to find such large persuasion effects. And I have some thoughts on why the environment lends itself to bigger persuasion effects, because I think people sort of misread conservatives' views of environmental protection. Conservatives are not like anti-environment. It's more, they generally value environmental protection. They just don't care as much about it as liberals do. They don't moralize it as liberals do. And so they're unwilling to suffer perceived economic trade-offs or expansion of government, which they don't like, in order to do more environmental protection. So I don't think, there's a reason we don't usually find these strong of effects. Conservatives are open to persuasion on this topic. We also measured people's concern about global warming. This is like 10 years ago, so these concern levels would assuredly be higher now, or at least a little higher now. And what we found was conservatives reported significantly more concern about global warming if they read the purity essay than if they read one of the other two essays, though this did not reduce the robust ideological difference in views of global warming to insignificance. But it's noteworthy that the essay didn't even mention global warming. That's just like a related environmental issue. So this would be like a spillover effect to a not mentioned environmental issue. Okay, so coming out of this study, we had some initial evidence that you can leverage people's moral values to make new political arguments that might persuade them on positions, to hold positions they don't currently hold, or at least hold them more than they currently hold them. But we wanted to show that this was robust to different topics, different moral values you might connect to. So the next topic we studied was same-sex marriage. And what we did here was, this was based on a sample of university alumni, 250 or so university alumni. And what we did was we have this method, right, where we're like, okay, so same-sex marriage, who doesn't support same-sex marriage? Okay, conservatives. What are the moral values they hold more than liberals? These three moral values. Okay, so can we make an argument that makes some sense that you should support same-sex marriage because of purity and sanctity? Well, we couldn't really come up with one. What about respect for authority? Couldn't really come up with one. What about in-group loyalty? We thought we could come up with that. So that's what we did to see if that would be persuasive to conservatives. So here's what we did. We randomly assigned people. Again, there was a control essay, which I believe was about the history of chairs. Let me find a theme. You'd like to find an essay that doesn't particularly have an effect on people, but nonetheless, gives them the experience of reading something. So that's why we're always studying these. We're using these control essays that are kind of ridiculously neutral and benign. And then we compared it to a kind of a traditional marriage, same-sex marriage argument in terms of fairness. So that essay, these are just excerpts. It said things like gay couples deserve the right to get married. The law requires that all citizens be treated equally and have the same opportunity to pursue happiness. Legalizing same-sex marriage is the only fair course of action in a country founded on the principle of equality. And then we compared this to a very different argument for same-sex marriage that we hadn't heard. It was based on the the moral value of loyalty, and it specifically invoked patriotism, loyalty to the country. So some excerpts from this, it said things like same-sex couples are proud and patriotic Americans. They share the same basic hopes and desires as all Americans. Like other proud Americans, gay couples peacefully build lives together, buy homes, and contribute to the American economy and society. And here are the results. We found that conservatives who were presented with the loyalty argument reported significantly more support for same-sex marriage than either of the other two essays. Again, here the effect size is smaller, this is more typical of what we found in research since then. And also of note, something we don't tend to find, but we did find here, so I wanted to call it out, is that we actually found a fall off in support amongst liberals from when they heard the argument for same-sex marriage in terms of fairness, a value that uniquely resonates with liberals, versus group loyalty, a value that that liberals endorse much less or significantly less. So that's noteworthy. I believe have never found this in any other study, this sort of fall off in the group that is not targeted for persuasion. But especially if you were trying to implement the strategy in the world, you want to be very mindful backlash effects in the group that you're hoping continues to hold the belief that you're trying to persuade other people to hold. If you're just moving some people up and other people come down, then it's not a very helpful method. So anyway, I just wanted to call that out. So this is a couple of our early studies we did on this, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about successful and unsuccessful replications that happened since then. So I'm going to linger on this page for a little bit. Probably the biggest area of research using moral reframing, or really the biggest area of research on political persuasion in general, is on environmental attitudes. And there have been multiple replications of this technique there, including a direct replication of the first study that I showed you that was done by another lab with a representative sample of Americans. There was a really interesting study on universal basic income that was done by some folks here at Stanford, who showed that framing universal basic income in terms of its ability to provide workers liberty and freedom was resonant. Liberty and freedom are not in the moral foundations, but they're, I think, clearly values that conservatives care a great deal about, which made this, I think, a smart study to do. There have been multiple studies, as you might imagine, of trying to extend this to support for political candidates. And let's see here, one of these was unsuccessful and one of these was successful. I have thoughts on why the Peterson and Siminovitz study was unsuccessful, but I'm not going to linger on. I'll just report it here. We have a recent study on immigration attitudes where we found moral reframing can increase openness to legal immigration in the US. We've also studied this. You may see a preponderance of like liberal social issues being tested for political persuasion. We've also studied this on conservative social issues like support for military spending and making English the official language of the United States, and found that the technique can work there as well. It's been applied a little bit to behavior, to charitable giving, but not a lot of studies of behavior. We tried to apply it to COVID behavioral intentions early in the pandemic to see if you could use moral reframing to get conservatives to do more mask wearing, or at least report the intention to do more mask wearing and social distancing. This was not successful. Other people have found patriotism framing of public health behaviors during the pandemic can be successful in changing intentions, at least. I think that our study here looked too obvious. It was too much of a direct persuasive appeal, and people felt potentially manipulated in an information space where they're just being assaulted with persuasive appeals. But that's post hoc. We thought this would work. So, and then there have been some really interesting field experiments done using moral reframing. One was done by the Analyst Institute in 2016. This is a progressive political research organization in DC, and they sent out direct mailings that were anti-Trump or pro-Hillary. They're left of center, so they were only testing how to get Hillary more votes in 2016, and they used moral reframing or didn't in these direct mailings, and found a 3% increase in conservatives' subsequent voting for, or reported voting for, Hillary Clinton relative to Donald Trump in a set of 10 or 8 swing states. And they actually have strict confidentiality rules around their results. That's actually all I'm allowed to say about that study. I have like permission to say 3 sentences about this study. They also did a study in 2020 testing anti-Trump TV ads, and their effects were null for moral reframing. Although other research showed that all TV ads, well, another study suggested that anti-Trump appeals in general were unsuccessful at that stage because views of Trump had been so crystallized after 5 years of tons and tons of Trump exposure of arguments on both sides. And then finally, there's a really interesting field experiment that David Brockman and the ubiquitous David Brockman and Josh Kalla did just, I think, about a year or 2 ago, where they trained door-to-door canvassers to use moral reframing in contacting people about abortion and trying to persuade people on their abortion attitudes, and found some, pretty promising effects here of moving people in door-to-door contacts using moral reframing relative to just kind of standard door-to-door canvassing, standard of care canvassing approaches, and with the biggest effects being like intentions to take action to support like a pro-choice ballot initiative or referendum, but also significant effects on views of Planned Parenthood. And there's some evidence for persistence of these over time. Okay, so I want to tell you about one other study that we've done along these lines, but maybe I'll stop for 1 second. Just, is there any questions, any clarifying questions about what I've been talking about? Okay.
I'm curious.
Yeah,
I have a quick question I'd like to ask.
Yeah, Jake.
So a lot of the stuff you've been talking about seems to be like geared towards persuading people to adopt support for a certain position. So like you were just talking about like pro-choice attitudes. Does it only move, like, does your research and like what you reviewed suggest that like things only move in that direction, or do they also move in the opposite direction where like you can convince people to now believe who used to be pro-choice that actually abortion's always wrong or something like that?
You mean, and are you saying, is it effective for moving people towards conservative views or just moving people down in levels of support for something? Like,
I'm not sure, yeah, if it's just about like moving towards the conservative side, but like a lot of these are about getting someone to agree with something they didn't used to agree with.
Yeah.
But does it, like, can you also get someone to disagree with something they used to believe or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a couple different answers to that. So a lot of these effects are on populations where they could have been considered to have had the opposite view before the persuasive appeal. So that's like one thing I hear you asking is like, can you get people to like change their minds? And in general, I would say the effect sizes are too small to claim that there's a lot of actual mind changing where people are going from like oppose an issue to support an issue. It's the effect sizes on average are smaller than that, but there is persuasion amongst those people who currently oppose something, if that makes sense, but it's small effects. And then the other thing I hear in your question is, can you increase people's opposition to something? And the only study I can think of that really tried to do that would be the Donald Trump field experiment. That didn't work, although I kind of think for different reasons, just that people had made up their minds about Trump, so it was just hard to move. So yeah, I guess that's a gap. And sometimes political projects are about stopping things, especially conservative political projects. So where you want to protect the status quo. So it's a gap. Yeah.
Rob, I might as well hop in here since my question
Do it.
can go now. And sorry if I'm chopping. My wife is on an NIH panel right now, so we're both using a lot of Wi-Fi.
Oh yeah, you seem great. Yeah.
So it seems like there's a fair amount of heterogeneity in the effects a little bit. And one thing I wonder is whether it seems that moral reframing often works, but I wonder if it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife in some sense, where like sometimes it works for different reasons, and perhaps the locus of it working is not a value per se, but things that sometimes co-vary with the value. So in the first example of harm and purity, the harm was to fishes, really, but the purity example was almost like harm to oneself, right? So
that's true. Yeah.
It really highlights the kind of like, you're going to drink polluted water. And I think everyone is afraid of harming themselves in some sense of drinking polluted water, which is maybe why everyone goes up. And then in the gay marriage, the loyalty is maybe conservatives seeing similarity with someone, and perhaps the liberals go down because they see gay people as now conservative somehow. So it's not saying that it definitely seems to work, but it might seem to work for different reasons across the manipulations if, let's say, there's not consistent, foundation values or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I take your point. For the environmental example, I'd want to look at the essays again to see just how bad that confound is, because I just need to read them again, because I'm not confident that the harm one didn't identify harms that would apply to the self as well as to ecosystems or whatever. But that would not be a confound that's present in many of the studies. The other point that, I mean, there's kind of two big mechanism stories here, two big reasons why the effect might happen. So one is that the argument just makes sense to you and is persuasive to you because it's in terms of first principles you believe strongly, and so you find it convincing. If you tried to convince me to go see a band and you were like, they're a lot like the Pixies and Pavement, I like Pixies and Pavement, so that makes sense to me and I'm more likely to see the band. That's kind of the one we've ridden with, and we have some evidence for it, but we don't have like knock your socks off evidence for it because perhaps because it's not the only mechanism, but also because it's pretty hard to study. And then another would be that something about the argument signals that the person is in like a common group with you, and you ought to agree with them because they're credible to you. So you share a moral community with them, or a political community with them, or they're conservative like you, or they're patriotic like you, or they're a Republican like you, or religious like you, something like that. And you're like, oh, okay, I'm conservative / Republican / religious / patriotic. I will agree with this person more because I have something in common with them. And we have evidence that that isn't the whole story, but we don't really have a strong understanding of how much the effect is due to these two causal pathways, which I think of as probably the two primary candidate pathways. But speaking of, signaling the source of the message, and speaking of candidates, let me show you this study, and we'll get a little bit more data to chew on in thinking about this question of why these effects are happening. So this is a hypothetical candidate study where we were interested in whether or not you could reliably change levels of support for a political candidate. So we showed people a hypothetical 2020 Democratic candidate who was ostensibly a challenger to Donald Trump. The person was portrayed as having either an economically progressive or moderate platform, which was just something of substantive interest at this time. We had 4 different framing conditions. So we gave speech excerpts from this candidate where they talked about their platform in different terms. So in one of the conditions, they talked about their platform in terms of these individualizing foundations that liberals hold more than conservatives. In another condition, they talked about their platform in terms of these binding foundations that conservatives tend to hold more. In another condition, which was interesting to us because it's a non-moral way that candidates often talk, we had the candidate talk in more like technocratic language. I'll show you in a second what that means. But we wanted to have a persuasive appeal condition that was non-moral. So this was our effort to do it. And then we have just a no persuasive content condition where you don't read any speech excerpts from the candidate. And instead you just read some like boring stuff about what an election is. And but in all these conditions, you found out that the person was a Democrat and what the details of their economic policy platform was. And part of what's nice about that theoretically is we should be holding constant the source to a great extent here. The person is, if you're a conservative, they're not in your identity group, you have policy information, you have party affiliation. You might still make some inferences that they're a relatively conservative, progressive Democrat, but we've constrained how much you can make those inferences a great deal here. And then we ran this 2 ways. We ran on a mechanical Turk sample, and then we replicated it on a national probability sample, which we recruited through NORC. So here are excerpts from the materials. So this one was the individualizing foundation, and I'll just speed through this. I've highlighted these kind of buzzwords that especially were meant to signify that this person is speaking in terms of the individualizing foundations. Were not bolded in the original piece, but you can see here, this candidate would talk about economic justice, fairness, compassion, stopping corporations from exploiting people, discrimination, economic justice. Elsewhere, they talked about social justice. So this person's talking in terms of these more individualizing moral foundations. We compared that candidate to a candidate who spoke very differently about their progressive or moderate economic platform. And this person emphasized like loyalty and respect, America, loyalty to country, freedom, the American dream, family and community, patriotism, sacredness, degradation, dignity, etc. America, America, America. So lots of invocation of binding moral foundations. This is the aforementioned technocratic candidate. And this is a way that candidates talk, especially Democrats. We actually based this on an essay or an op-ed that Tim Kaine wrote. And it emphasized like growth, productivity, GDP per capita, good paying jobs, small businesses, prosperity, jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And so here are the overall results. This is just collapsing across the whole sample, liberals, conservatives, moderates, everybody. And you can see here that the 2 better performing candidates were the ones that talked in terms of the binding moral foundations consistent with moral reframing. And then the candidate who spoke in terms of the technocratic language, which we did not expect. We thought that the binding moral foundations would outperform the technocratic language, but we were wrong about that. And then breaking this out, which is I think more interesting, breaking this out by the ideology of the people in the study, looking at liberals, moderates, and conservatives separately, we see that all the action is amongst the moderates and conservatives. So the liberals are like, Democrat with an economic policy agenda that I like, I'm going to vote for this person against Donald Trump, regardless of the, how this person's talking. You see a little bit of a fall off, but it's not significant when they talk in terms of these more like conservative values, if you will. We never really find effects amongst moderates. We usually only find effects amongst conservatives because we're targeting conservative values here. So this is kind of noteworthy and interesting to think about, that we found pretty robust effects that replicated in the nationally representative sample. I should say the two samples have all the same interaction effects, or pretty strikingly similar results. And yeah, so you see here for moderates and conservatives that they're the subsets of the sample where the binding and technocratic frames are more effective for driving candidate support. And then you also see that the binding frame is actually outperforms the technocratic frame amongst conservatives, which makes sense because the binding frame is really targeting conservatives' morality. So they're really being sort of micro-targeted here. Let's see here. Oh, this is one thing that we included that we thought was interesting. More fodder for future research is the extent to which let's see if I can articulate this right. The extent to which people's support for this Democratic candidate was correlated with their racial resentment, their levels of racial resentment, which is a correlation that like people's presidential support or presidential preferences have become more correlated with their racial resentment in the United States, or at least whites have, over the last 5 years, basically since Donald Trump showed up. And so this is just among whites. We were interested in, would one of these frames reverse that a bit and bring that association down? Would it reduce the role, if you will, of racial resentment in deciding how much you support, in this case, a challenger to Donald Trump? And what we found was that the technical and binding frame conditions both reduce the role of racial resentment in people's candidate support. And this is, I think, that for a number of reasons, this is really just an exploratory finding, but I think it's interesting. My sort of interpretation of this would be that here you're giving policies that benefit most people and moral frames that are persuasive to conservatives who tend to be higher in racial resentment and moderates who are higher than liberals. And you're crowding out the role of racial resentment in their candidate choice. You're giving them another reason to base their candidate support on, or two other reasons. Okay, so one thing we get often with this research is it's very intuitive, especially after you've heard it. Like why wouldn't you think to articulate an argument in terms of the things that the person you're speaking to believes the most in or values the most? For example, if you're trying to sell a used car to someone, you're trying to sell them your car, you're not going to talk to them about what's in it for you, and how excited you are to get their money and all the cool things you're going to spend it on. You would attend to their perspective. You would think like, what is good about the car and why is it a good deal for them? But our argument is that this is not actually the way people approach, persuasion in the political domain. Like our first thought is to render our own reasons for holding the political positions we do. And we really don't intuitively think about other people's perspectives. But as for whether this idea is intuitive or not, I found this interesting quote from Blaise Pascal a couple of years ago, where he said, "It is necessary to have regard to the person whom we wish to persuade, what principles he acknowledges, and then observe in the thing in question what affinity it has with the acknowledged principles," which is just like a more elegant and also more general articulation of the idea that I've been talking to you about today, which is just like the plight of the social scientists. Is you think you have a new idea, and then it turns out that a French guy with terrific hair had that idea, a half a millennium ago. But just while in the abstract, the idea might seem really obvious, it's not very obvious to people when they're working on autopilot and making political arguments. So for example, we recruited a sample of liberals to make pro same-sex marriage arguments. We even said, we'll pay you if you're effective and you persuade a conservative with your argument. And they overwhelmingly used individualizing moral foundations, not binding moral foundations that our research suggests would be more persuasive. Conservatives, same pattern. When we recruited a lot of conservatives to make persuasive arguments for why English should be the official language of the United States, they make arguments in terms of binding moral values, not individualizing moral values. We coded environmental rhetoric from op-eds in major American newspapers and public service announcements. that most of that rhetoric is in the harm, care, moral domain, some in the fairness domain, very little in these binding moral foundations, very little rhetoric of that sort, presumably because it's mostly liberals making pro-environmental protection arguments and they're using their own moral values. This is a possibly overly complex analysis to render in the next few minutes, but this is a graph. We analyzed the moral word usage of every presidential and vice presidential candidate since 2000, from every debate that they did, and graphed them in terms of their economic ideology, which is like pretty representative of their general political ideology, measured via inferences of political ideology inferred from their donor base, which is publicly available, and all donors have been assigned political ideology numbers based on which Congress people they support the most, and so you can sort of you can reverse this to figure out people's candidates' political ideology, even if they've never been in Congress, based on shared donors. So that's the x-axis, and then the y-axis is the ratio of binding moral words used in debates relative to individualizing moral words used. I mean, one thing that's just kind of interesting here is that Republicans, consistently use more of these ostensibly conservative moral values than liberals, which they ought to, if that theory is right. But the thing that was interesting for our purposes is that there's just like not a lot of folks over here in this zone, which our research would suggest would be a very effective zone where you use binding moral foundations to articulate a more progressive economic policy. Progressive economic policy is really, really popular. And then binding moral foundations can add support if you're a Democrat. They wouldn't if you were a Republican. But this would be the zone with John Edwards, Dennis Kucinich, if you remember him, Eric Swalwell, a lot of sort of economically populist, economically progressive Democrats. But it's not super represented, even though it's the one that our research would suggest would be really effective. One thing, so this has also been a technique that's been widely applied. For example, just one example that sticks out because it was very on the nose application was Elizabeth Warren had a job, kind of basically a Green New Deal plan that she rolled out during her campaign, which she called the Plan for Economic Patriotism, and she talked about it in terms of more conservative values. And this was very much a play to get white working class voters who were probably conservative but potentially Democrats, sort of former Union, Upper Midwest demographics. She wanted to build support in that group, so she used moral reframing. And I think the various positive effects we found in prior research and some of the applications have led people to describe it as sort of like one quick trick for political persuasion. This is like literally described as a simple psychological trick for political persuasion. This is not, is it that? It is not that, I wouldn't say, and I'll try to explain a better way to think about it. And I'm not throwing shade at Olga Kazan, who's a very good science writer and probably didn't write this headline. So let's talk about limitations and boundary conditions. So one is, the research is pretty clear that reframe messages can also be unpersuasive. There are examples of this. The clearest example is that very, very short messages based on reframing don't work, or I haven't seen any evidence that they work in a well-powered study. One of the earliest tests of this was by, Day et al. In 2014. They did just like one sentence statements of like supporting abortion as an issue is a matter of patriotism or something like that. And that is not enough to change people's thoughts about the association between their values and their politics. Or at least that's my interpretation of why these short messages don't work. And so it's a difficulty of, if you're going to make a credible argument for a new kind of consistency between moral values and a specific political position, you need some real estate. You're going to need at least a couple or three paragraphs and a good argument to convince anybody that those things are consistent. You can't just say it. That doesn't convince anybody. But then when you do a couple paragraphs of persuasion, you inevitably wind up creating some confounds in your treatment, like Kurt pointed out with the environmental study, which may have emphasized effects on the self more in the purity condition than the harm condition. Even if you take that out, there's going to be other confounds there. But if you try to make an argument for why the environment's a matter of purity in one sentence that's tightly controlled, you're not going to have any effect at all. So this is a difficulty. Also, I think that reframe, we haven't actually seen a lot of examples of this, except maybe the same-sex marriage study I showed you, but reframing backfires, I expect, if it offends base values. So you could get backlash effects amongst the group that already holds the political position if you make reframed argument that actually offends their value. So what would be an example of this? I mean, one thing, if you look at this whole literature on reframing, one thing you notice is that researchers are constructing these persuasive appeals in a way to not elicit backlash in the base. So like you could make a group loyalty-based argument for same-sex marriage that's super offensive, that's in turn, or to liberal moral sensibilities, that's about America being the most important country in the world, being clearly better than everybody else, like a hyper-nationalist or ethno-nationalist argument that I don't know how you connect that to same-sex marriage, but say you found some way to do it, it would turn off liberals, and we didn't do it that way, even though that is within the loyalty foundation. So this is important to articulate as a boundary condition, because I haven't yet, is that there's a way to do a loyalty argument for same-sex marriage that would be effective, and there are ways to do it that would be ineffective or even could elicit backlash effects. And so that should all be fleshed out better, but this is my going read on it, is don't offend base values if you don't want backlash effects. James, we'll take your question.
Yeah, that ties in really quickly with something I was thinking earlier. Do you know how, maybe this isn't the right word, but like how sticky these changes are? Like if you manage to change someone's mind on an issue, does it stay? Do they keep thinking that, or do they revert back to some base value after a given amount of time without like a reinforcement? Because I could see it being effective if it is not very sticky, to hammer this for a short period of time and reinforce it enough in people who are holding the value that like same-sex marriage should not be supported. You hammer it in enough that it changes them to hold a softer position on that, but then the stickiness will bring back the people you've lost.
Yeah, especially if they go back to their political community and hear other arguments the other way.
Right.
Yeah, I think I love the question. It's a terrific question. It's a great point. I think there are it's basically just the field of experiments that have tested for durability effects. And for the most part, those experiments also had, so 2 out of the 3 of those did show durable persuasive effects. One of the Analyst Institute studies, not the other one, and then the canvassing study. And notably, one of the 2 that showed durable effects, the better powered one, which was the canvassing study, also had easily the most impactful intervention of any of these. So I wouldn't expect, I don't know, maybe with a ton of power, you might find that reading a 3-paragraph essay could have a persistent effect like a week later, but I wouldn't expect it like 3 months later to have an effect. But a door-to-door canvassing interaction, where somebody talks through it with you and makes a credible argument, re-articulates it a few times, I'm not surprised that they did find, durable effects for that kind of a more meaningful encounter. Jonathan?
Yeah, Rob, I think you definitely just now got to part of what my question was going to be, which was, was there ever, I guess, in your, in the literature or in some of the older projects you worked on, was there like more consideration at least into who the, person was giving them this message, for example, a family member or a friend? I know that, those could be potential other factors that might, for example, affect the durability or affect just how long this is going. I know that you mentioned that, the longer you get, the more confounds, right? But those are also potential variables that have looked at that. And I was wondering if the literature kind of pointed towards that, or was getting there to that point.
No, it's hard to do. It's a great question. And it is a path to application. In fact, this is peer contacting has emerged as like a major political persuasion technique, and in general, in early field experiments, is shown to be more effective than a stranger texting you, right? So I think there's a lot of potential there. I think the challenge is training people up, to do this effectively. But right now, there's like basically no research on your question, which I think is a good question. The closest would be that candidate support study, I guess, where you know some stuff about the candidate, and so it's along the lines of what you're asking, but it is different. Let me just wrap this up, and then we'll take these questions. So another limitation: small effect sizes. If you see large effect sizes with political persuasion research, you should be suspicious, and you don't generally see them here. And then it's much more often tested on liberal issues and candidates than conservative ones, which might make you worried about whether the theoretical ideas behind it are really robust. So just to reflect on the motivating questions, does the persuasive technique work? And I think the answer is yes, it can, but it can also not work. So there are necessary conditions for it working. And then do we do it? There I'm more confident that the evidence is pretty clear that we don't do it. So I'll speak to these last things and just not show you that, and just acknowledge my collaborators on this research and some of the folks in my lab that have contributed to this. And thanks for your time and attention, and we'll do more questions. Do I field them myself? Okay.
If you feel comfortable, then happy to have you do it.
Okay, thanks, Kurt. So I saw Chase's hand next.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation, Professor. My question is sort of a two-part question. You talked a lot in the beginning about how there's just a lot of diversity in America, and that caused a lot of political polarization, which changes things. I just personally have learned that American politics, I've heard, is very much kind of skewed towards the center or center right compared to a lot of other countries. I know, like, for example, in a lot of countries in South America or Europe, there's everything from on the right, like Christian nationalist parties, and on the left, like communist and anarchist parties, which would be sort of unthinkable in America on both sides. And so that in this two-part thing, I just want to know, when translating that to morality, because, you said that, political beliefs often translate to morality, does that mean that Americans' just sort of moral oppositions are actually a lot closer to each other compared to a lot of other countries? And, accordingly, does that change like how moral reframing works? Does it make it easier for countries with political systems like America? Does it make it easier for people to have these moral/political shifts? Anything like that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And, there is cross-national research on just, levels of endorsement of these moral foundations. And I don't remember in enough detail to give you a good answer what it shows. My thought was that it showed pretty consistent left-right differences in levels of endorsement of the moral foundations across cultures, but you can't even administer the questionnaire in some cultures because it's, it's in English and it's got some culturally specific content. I guess one thought I have is that I'm sort of answering a part of your question of, like, is there more moral polarization in the US than elsewhere? And my instinct would be to say yes, just because there's such a strong religious community in the US. There's such a strong, like, evangelical community in the US. And then there's like a hyper educated, very, very progressive community in the US on the far left. And these groups go like really far away from each other. And you see these groups, in other societies, of course, in the West especially, but not as strong. We just have more religiosity in the US. But I didn't really do your question justice. I just chewed on a part of it. But yeah, I'd like to get a better answer to it. Thanks, Chase. I saw Morgan's hand next.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. It was fantastic. I actually have two questions that are unrelated to one another, I suppose. The first question is methodological. Have you considered doing some sort of linguistic analysis, having some open-ended questions after you ask, whether you would support this policy, and saying, here's maybe some underlying mechanisms, or here's how their arguments changed based upon the argument that they're presented?
Yes. Yeah. That's very cool. We've not done that. But that's a very good idea. It also would be interesting just to have people write about their new view, about their view after seeing the appeal, because I would bet that would also help with persuasion, because they would sort of, in the moment of persuasion, exercise the new view a few times. And that's actually probably part of why the canvassing works, is because part of it is you sort of talk with them about their views getting updated in the interaction, and they're telling you about it. And prior research shows that articulating something can kind of make it land more deeply cognitively. So that's a good idea. Partly as a persuasion catalyst.
Yeah, definitely some more deliberative type processing.
Right.
And so my second question is, in a second world of mine, I am working with some Intel analysts for the military, and part of what they're doing is open source information analysis, including Twitter data, for example. Do you think that you could almost reverse engineer this sort of persuasion technique and identify others attempting to persuade you or persuade a specific community based on the moral framing, for example, that they use?
Yeah, I think you probably could do that. I think that, so a challenge is that text analysis around the moral foundations is
right.
really weak right now. So I've showed you this graph where we looked at word usage and which moral foundation it reflected. And the only reason we're powered enough to even find an association there is because we looked at a huge amount of text between people that are very ideologically different, and we collapsed across all the different moral foundations into binding and individualizing. But in general, use of this dictionary of words associated with the moral foundations, it shows you don't find very robust associations. Like conservatives don't really clearly use the binding foundations more than liberals and so on. So we need better text analytic techniques. And right now, honestly, if I was to do one thing, I would just do trained human coding still, because it works on smaller chunks of text, than quantitative text analytic techniques would. So that's still, I think, the best way to do it. But hopefully we'll beat that at some point.
Yeah, I think there's an article that came out this year that showed, I think it was the embedded NLP technique was a little bit better than the bag of words dictionary based type technique for language analysis. So
yeah, the only problem with trained human coders is just they can only do so much text, but like most of the techniques that you would do would involve some kind of training AI to do what the humans did, and so you couldn't really do better than the humans. You're just trying to approximate the humans, or that would be the next thing I would do. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan.
All right, maybe 2 more questions, and then we'll let Rob go to things, and everyone else who didn't get asked can write Rob aggressive emails, since it's in private.
Very aggressive,
in front of other people.
I won't understand them if they're not aggressive. Yeah. So I saw Sarah's hand next.
Hi. So I don't know how well this question is going to come out because I'm still kind of like working through it in my head.
Sure.
But beyond just the question of does the persuasive technique of moral reframing work, is the goal of moral reframing to teach how to best extract the truth from the lie, or extract the right way from the wrong way, or how to best beat the other side out? Because both believe what they believe is the truth and what the other side believes is the lie or the wrong way. So in this like battle between weighing the morality of one side and the morality of the other side, like what is the essential truth that we're trying to work towards that will unite both sides? Because if you're just trying to beat out the other side, it's like, how do you know that
you're right? No,
that is the truth?
Yeah.
Just because you have the best like strategy to the other side conform. Yeah, it's
an excellent question. And I guess so this is full on in relativist subjective moral land, where you could use moral reframing to bring people closer to political opinions that are more in line with evidence or further from them. You also could use it on just sort of really pretty purely morally subjective topics that, where evidence isn't really the primary basis of somebody's position. I would say most of our application is to things where if you have a certain moral value, you'll tend to have a certain political position regardless of your read of the facts of the matter. So we're like pretty fully in like subjective land here. And I guess this offers me a good opportunity to note the caveat that there's nothing intrinsically morally virtuous about this technique. Unlike, say, anyway, there's other ways of bridging political divides I think you could argue they're sort of intrinsically virtuous because they reduce political conflict or, social conflicts. This is not really like that. You could use moral reframing for very bad ends. You could use it for what I would consider more virtuous ends. And history is replete with examples of moral reframing being used to do terrible things, from the loyalty and purity-based arguments of the Third Reich or fascists in Italy in the 1930s to purity and patriotism arguments used by the Khmer Rouge. Like you can find all sorts of terrible examples of moral reframing being used to do really like the worst things in human history. But also you can see examples of it being used to pass political initiatives that you would probably really care about. So just wanted to highlight that it's no more virtuous than the end that it's put to, which is sort of answering your question, I hope.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Just to add on a tiny bit, if I can.
Sarah, sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
We only have time for one more question, so we'll get one more person to get in. Sorry to cut you off. for
Alright.
equality and fairness, I guess,
Totally,
is
someone
moral
else.
framing.
Values I do not hold. Okay, sorry, I saw Francisco next.
Yeah, so first things first, thank you for the great talk. It was really informative. As per my question, so I was thinking about how you interpret the results of the study where you asked liberals and conservatives to provide arguments as to convince someone else of something. And I was wondering, so did you actually provide participants with specific arguments and they had to choose, or they were free to generate their points? Because, well, I'm mentioning this because people on one side might not really be able or know how to connect with the other side. So people only know so much as about their perspectives and, you know, all about echo chambers, I guess. So they mostly know how to support one stance because they interact with like-minded peers. So it might be the case that they're simply not providing arguments that are somehow reframing their point because they don't really know how to, not necessarily because they choose not to do it.
Yeah. Okay, so outstanding question. I'll try to, this has been a whole area of interest to me. So I'll try to answer briefly in deference to the time. So I see like maybe three possibilities here. I think you just listed them, is like people might not realize that the morally reframed message on average will be more persuasive. They might realize it, but be unwilling to do it for sort of moral or political purity reasons, you know? And then a third possibility, I think is the last one, is they might not be able to do it because it's technically, it's hard. It involves perspective taking. You might, it would help to know about this moral foundations theory, perhaps. And then, okay. So, and then there's multiple reasons people might be unwilling to do it. Like they actually strategically think it's a bad play, or they think from a pure, they think it's impure, you know, like they want to stick to the purity of their ideology. They don't even want to exercise views in terms of values they don't hold. So we tried to study this with a series of kind of small sort of studies that are not really tight. They're just sort of exploratory and interesting. So one, we showed people moral, you know, like the arguments that we had tested in prior studies and said, okay, you need to send one of these to, say, a conservative, and we'll pay you if you're persuasive. You should try to be persuasive. And on average, liberals and conservatives were good at seeing that the reframed message would be more persuasive. They also, so when we asked them which one would be more persuasive, they're pretty good at that. We asked them, which one do you want to send? They mostly were willing to do that. So in both cases, conservatives were like a little better than liberals. Conservatives are a little better than liberals at seeing that the reframed message would be more persuasive. And when I say better, they were a little more willing to send the reframed message than liberals. But the majorities for conservatives and liberals were able to see the reframed message was more persuasive and were willing to send it. And so that leaves us with kind of the last explanation. So why don't people spontaneously do it? I think because it's hard and they don't have the knowledge base to do it necessarily. But then the canvassing study suggests that at least politically engaged, motivated, and informed people could be trained to do it quite effectively in the field. So that's where I think that all lands.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so let's give Rob one more big Zoom hand. And thanks to all of you for asking such wonderful questions and for showing up at this talk today, the first of 8. So stay tuned next week for another delightful talk. I'll be tweeting about it soon. And for those of you who are part of the summer seminar, you have that link in the syllabus and we will meet you there. So thanks everyone. Have a great week. Stay safe and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks everybody. Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you.